It's going to be a long recovery, all kinds of recovery, right? Not just physical.
And will we learn anything from this? And when we think about in industry, I've been dying to get hold of a warehousing network to redesign it for social distancing from square one, not kind of, a number of my colleagues have said, oh yeah, we've done the social distancing. What did you do differently? Oh, we took out some canteen chairs so that we sit further away, and we give them some hand sanitizer, and jobs are good. And no, I'm talking about the fundamental design of a warehouse so that people don't get anywhere near each other as they go around doing this picking and packing, marshalling, loading. The whole thing, we must do this because we need to have businesses which are really resilient to future occurrences like a pandemic. And I don't think people are even thinking that far ahead, but I'm already on that to think about what that might look like in terms of warehouse management system design, how we configure that in a different way, the architecture of warehouses, the processes, the way we bring about a certain amount of cultural change, how we measure success around here. And that goes into retail outlets, transportation systems, the whole lot. We need to have a real rethink because we're just being pretty lazy in our thinking what might happen ahead, and what are the implications, and what will we learn, and what will we be doing so much better to protect our citizens, our workers from these events in the future. We need to find resilience. And I think that's a message not just for Canada, that's for all countries across the world.
Welcome, and thank you for joining me today. My name is Gary Newbury. I'm a senior executive on call, helping businesses in the make, move, sell flow of consumer goods and services. My purpose is to inspire business leaders, particularly those within the consumer products and retailing space, to think big, be bold, scale, adapt and win, one epic supply chain transformation at a time. There's additional content available through my website, RetailAID.ca, or on my YouTube channel, RetailAID. Be sure to check it out. As the business world faces much volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, organizations need to be tapping into resources with an inside edge on transitioning their teams to be agile, innovative, and digital, with thought leaders, experts, and senior executives who have mastery of operational turnarounds and strategic transformations to help reorientate their enterprises. There's great material to get through here, so let's get started.
Hi there, Gary. It's so lovely to be speaking with you. Thanks so much for taking the time.
You're very welcome. I'm very pleased to be contributing to this podcast series where there's some really big issues that we can talk about during the next 45 minutes about vaccine distribution.
Absolutely. Wonderful. So 2020 was all about COVID-19. It was about the pandemic. That's what anyone ever spoke about. And in 2021, it's vaccinations. This is something that everyone, the whole world really has waited for. The idea was once the vaccines are researched and approved and out in the market, all of our problems would go away. Now, obviously, most people don't work in supply chain like you and I do. And we know the problem is far from over, right? It's not the vaccines, it's actually the vaccinations. But before we get started on talking about the distribution of the COVID-19 vaccine itself, I think what would be helpful is if you can talk through what a basic supply chain even looks like. And then we'll kind of go on from there.
I'm happy to start there. So I come from a retail supply chain background. I've been in it for quite a number of years, to say the least. And what I've observed over a long period of time is that supply chains work in a certain way, that we have a supply network. We work with the supply network. We issue purchase orders. We typically bring product into a warehouse. We prepare it for store distribution. We send it out to stores. And of course, now we've got the added fun of having e-commerce against that, and whether or not we do it in a warehouse, do it in an intermediate warehouse, or do it from stores. But the whole intricacies of the supply chain are very well understood. The supply chains have existed for years, for decades, I would say. Certainly in their current format, we've had major technology changes like the container. It's as basic as that. the warehouse management system, demand planning tools and techniques. So everybody knows what we do. We tend to run the supply chain in what we call silos. Everybody, in the warehouse and the transportation, inventory management, reclaims, it all kind of works when we're in a nice steady state. But guess what? We still make mistakes. We still don't deliver everything we expected to have on the shelf, even after decade after decade after decade of improvement, of more sophistication, more technology. So the supply chain is all the individual logistics elements that are coordinated across an organization and beyond the organization with the supplier network to actually deliver value to the consumer. The consumer has an expectation. Our job as a retailer or as a component in the retail ecosystem is to deliver that value to the consumer on time at a place they want it. That's where some of our challenges, as we look at the vaccine distribution ecosystem or situation we find ourselves in, are becoming very clear to us that when we go back to our normal jobs, that we may need to take some lessons from the vaccine distribution and actually reapply it to our retail supply chain, manufacturing supply chain, whatever supply chain you might find yourself in, to say, we learned some really important lessons here. We need to bring them back and we need to improve our lot so we can actually do a much better job in our marketplaces.
How interesting. This is all incredible, obviously, cross-industry learning, especially now we're in a place where supply chains probably haven't been as strained as they ever have been in the past, especially with vaccines needing to be delivered pretty much to every person in the globe. Not a big deal now. Do you want to maybe start off with talking about what the end-to-end supply chain of the COVID-19 vaccine itself looks like? And then perhaps we'll get on to discussing specifically what lessons retail and other industries can take from this mega task.
Let me just start by just some kind of sound biting, because if we go back about 3 or 4 months, there was quite a lot of interest in vaccine distribution, how it's going to work out. Everybody gets it, no problem. But we didn't know who was going to do it, where it was going to come from, what problems they may have, because we were going to go up from no vaccine to maybe 20 billion vaccines distributed from or made by various different pharma producers. We weren't quite sure who that was. And we may distribute it and inoculate all the population or part of it, because we didn't know if we were going to have a voluntary or compulsory element to vaccinations. So given that whole context, and that we've never actually done anything like this before, we've done bits of this puzzle because we've had epidemics which have seen vaccinations being distributed on a regional basis. But when we have a pandemic, that's global, that's everybody. It's 7.5 billion people that have to be found, located, vaccinated once, and 20 days or 12 weeks later get vaccinated again. So we have a logistics problem which also has a political dimension. And the political dimension is this: we know we're going to go into a rationing situation. And the magic is this: whoever gets to be vaccinated first, to an extent, they can reopen their economies can seriously motor. When we sit in a retail supply chain, we really think about the competitor. We don't tend to think about much bigger issues about government, industrial strategies and stuff like that. We just want to nail the competitor, and hopefully we don't see Amazon in that bubble of competitors. But here we've got nations effectively duking it out about, I've got this great contract and I'm going to get all my people done first. And then we get these terms, vaccine nationalists, where different countries, if they've got the capabilities in their country to produce, may actually siphon it off to their own citizens. And it's perfectly natural in some ways for that to follow before they distribute it to other places in the world. And we've got a big issue between developed countries and developing countries, and whether they rank on the overall scale of the production of vaccines. So that's just a very broad context of which our supply chain, our vaccine distribution network, has to operate within. So there are a number of components in this, and some part of this is going to be a little bit Canadian to an extent, but I think that it's generalizable to other parts of the world. Canada is in the G7. So it has a couple of things going on here. It has a very large landmass and a very low population density. It's the second largest country in the world, but it's got not one of the smallest populations, but it's got a very low population density. It's about 3 people per square kilometre compared to where I come from, England, which was about 250 people per square. So the densities are different. And importantly, we do not have our own production capability. They got exported elsewhere because it was, guess what, a little bit cheaper elsewhere. In terms of our resilience as a country to fight off real life or death issues to our citizens, one of the important bastions of keeping control and managing that was exported to a foreign nation. So the supply chain, let's just look at this from what we see as a public. We hear Moderna, AstraZeneca, Pfizer, and there's probably a few others which are kind of loose in my mind. And they've got factories, some are in America, some are in Europe, some are in the EU, some are on the borders of the EU. We've got Russian, we've got Chinese equivalents of these, all going into the market. We think everyone's on full production, we're fine. Oh, there's a hold up. The factory's retooling, or maybe there's a chemical or something that's missing, so there's a delay. So we immediately get into rationing. The next link in the chain is actually how do we get it from the factory? And bear in mind, some of these vaccines have special handling characteristics, like having to be kept at -70, -80 degrees centigrade. I mean, there's no supply chain, certainly not in North America, that can maintain that temperature nationally, because we need to look at national and international supply chain capabilities that can hold it there. So they've developed little boxes. They put, I think it's 5,000 vials in there, slam the box closed, and then it can be transported typically in ambient conditions. When it gets into the country, it probably will be landed in an airport. From the airport, it needs to be decided whether or not it gets onto another plane. In Canada, if it lands in Toronto, it ought to get on a plane to go to Vancouver. It's 5 hours in a jet plane, so it's 5 days on the truck. So we need to get this stuff out to the regions and provinces in Canada. And then from then, we've got literally the kind of almost the last mile element from that central place where it lands to get it distributed into the communities of which the vaccination will take place. There's a whole raft of things going on to make that happen. Our emphasis, as we talk as logisticians, is all about getting the vaccine out of the factory, onto the plane, into the truck, to the place. But actually, there's a whole range of, materials, manpower, getting and a qualified resource into the place, plus a queue of people lined up so we can vaccinate at a real fast rate of knots. And then there is the rinse and repeat version of that, because in 20 days or in 12 weeks, depending which regime you're in and what policy the local governments are taking, we have to do that again. So we need to make sure, certainly in the short term, that the same vaccine is administered the second time. Although there is research being done, can we mix the vaccine so we can have Pfizer on the first one if we've got that? It doesn't matter if Pfizer run out, because we've got Moderna coming in, and we can jab people up on the second time with the other vaccine. And as I say, there's tests being done on the efficacy of, can you mix them, and does it still generate the same or very similar result? So that's a broad picture. So you've got manufacturing, travel through international transport networks to potentially an airport in the country, and then distribution to a region, and then effectively the last mile into the place where it's going to be administered.
Got it. Not complex at all. Very, very easy.
Right. Jobs are good.
Right. I mean, it took all 5 minutes. How tough can this be, right? Yeah. All right. So talk to me about where are the biggest bottlenecks throughout this value chain? Is it like, as someone even being, it's sometimes hard to understand, is it that there are not enough vaccines being developed? So is that a problem right there off the bat? Is it in the last mile? Is it somewhere in the middle mile? Is the cold chain managed to be successfully kept? Yeah, just where are the biggest bottlenecks?
From where I sit, I think the bottlenecks move around, because at the moment, as we speak in sort of February, we've recently encountered Pfizer having an issue with trying to retool, so it can actually, instead of producing say 100x, it can produce 200x, and hopefully that downtime and the extra production which will now be produced will kind of make up for that. But that's not really helpful when the clock is ticking. People's lives are on the line. So that was seen to be a difficulty, and Moderna's having issues with its supply network. So we would imagine, knowing that there's a whole research team trying to work out this DNA mix or whatever it is and suddenly produce it, given that they've all had big contracts from countries around the world saying we're committed to this level of production with you, that they wouldn't have already procured plenty of stuff, so that when they go into production, it's just flat out 7 days a week, 24 hours. And if they need to add in extra lines or even extra buildings to literally go at it, because whoever gets here first in terms of the vaccine producer may actually be looking at a very, very big market. There's 20 billion vaccines to produce, and given that, wouldn't you want to be right first to the gate? But they have adopted, I would say, a traditional supply chain thinking model, which is, let's wait until we know more, and then we'll do this if that happens. And that's certainly what seems to have happened with Pfizer, and the fact that Moderna has had some issues with its supply network getting the right chemicals in suggests that something about in their algorithms or their minimum stocks or whatever it is, or their bills of material, has got in the way, and it's left them short of vital components to actually make the vaccines. So there's some bottlenecks at the start, but let's assume that them and their competitors are all going full bore. All of a sudden we bump into issues about getting it from the point of production to the country requiring it. Well, we just assume that there's bags of planes, and in fact there are lots of planes which are grounded. But imagine that they're going full bore and we bump into this issue with air freight. Lots of people who can't get stuff across from China into the US because of all the port congestion at Los Angeles on the West Coast are all putting things on flights now. So flights are either fully laden with other traffic anyway, or just laid flat, and we've now laid off the staff because they're on furlough or just laid them off. So we've got a bit of an issue just ahead of us still, because if those factories, if the other vaccine production companies also go online and rush to get everything to everyone, because we may not have enough air freight capacity to get that out, because the idea that we've got 8,000 jumbos sticking around and they just waiting for the vaccines produced and off we go. Then we've got to make a decision about, do we, and certainly in Canada, do we fly them to another airport to get them into, say, the right province, or do we truck them? But let's assume that we fly them in. That's, again, making a big assumption. There is going to be capacity and flight crews to do this. So we've got the stuff. It's coming into Toronto. We sent it over to Vancouver. Now we're in a situation that we know we've got some vaccines. Now we can do some planning, because until we knew that was there, we couldn't actually line everybody up to have vaccinations until we actually had it in our hand. And this is one of the difficulties with this vaccine distribution thing. It's not like a retailing supply chain where, oh, we're out this week, don't worry, come back next week. You can't do anything until you've literally got it in your hand, because there's too much uncertainty. You can't line up all these resources. You can certainly make sure you've got as much PPE in as you can for the medical staff who's going to administer all this, and the right number of, say, syringes, that you've reserved the spaces, who's going to be involved in it. But you certainly don't know until you've got them in your hand how many you've got, and therefore how are you going to work through the list of people that you're bringing forward to be vaccinated. And if we look at the EU, they got their orders into the companies much later than the UK. That's why the UK's made so much progress. Plus, it's actually got homegrown production capacity. They're now having to slice up, well, when we get this stuff, we don't know what it is, but we've got to have a formula to actually allocate it to different countries. And those countries are sitting there going, what have I got? And I've got to make decisions about Who are my vulnerable classes? What's the order that I'm going to administer the vaccines in? I know there's a lot of complication, and these are life or death matters. These aren't just like, it's a stock out, don't worry. So we've got all these things, and these bottlenecks, it's not a bottleneck that's going to be, oh, we solved that one and we're fine. I think we're going to find bottleneck after, it's going to move around. And even when we get to the administration point where we're having the vaccines being administered, in Canada, we've had our pharmacy retailers putting their hand on it. We'll help. We've got the army actually involved in this, and for what they've had, they're doing a brilliant job, but they've not had the stream of vaccines that they needed to do to deploy their logistic skills into. So we've had volunteers coming forward in terms of companies, organisations like Shoppers Drug Mart, Rexall's, etc. They've all stepped up and said, look, we're used to doing the winter flu virus jabs. So, this should be just like a walk in the park. We've also had this kind of really weird thing that when Pfizer have been sending, I think it's Pfizer, or it might be Moderna, when they've been sending out vaccines, they normally are 5 in a jar, like in a vial or whatever, and a bit. And we're so desperate for vaccines, we've worked out we can actually get away, if we just get different types of syringes, we can actually get 6 out here. We've checked with the manufacturer, we can get 6 out and it will still have the same efficacy. That's how desperate we are for getting hold of the vaccine.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of information there to what seems to be a very strict, where is the bottleneck, but what we'll find through this whole process, it will move around and we have to think on our feet. How do we solve that? How do we get over this to get to the next stage?
Absolutely. Wow. That is just a whole bunch going on. And I think what you say makes perfect sense, right? Even if production is enough today, maybe that's the problem tomorrow. Even if administration is okay today, maybe that's the problem tomorrow. So like you said, it's a constant shift and then a constant reiteration of what needs to happen where. So out of curiosity, from what I understand, when it comes to inoculations, when it comes to a successful vaccine drive, for the most part, it's governments that are responsible for planning it all out, right? I'm curious, what kind of help do governments seek from existing private companies or existing companies that make them a lot more qualified, perhaps, to plan something like this than even the government themselves?
I found, having come to Canada, I didn't even know how these things work, because we have a federal system, we have a provincial system, we have regionals, and we have municipalities. And each one of these has different levels of preoccupation during these times. So you think that it would make sense for the federal government to be responsible for it because it's a national thing. Oh, yeah, that's okay, except that there are some exceptions for provincial. And in fact, within Canada, some of the provincial governments have taken control from the federal because they have a view about their performance or not. And then as you work down the system of government and then the vaccination distribution system, there are parts of it which are under municipality control. And it's very intriguing and very worrying that so many people are getting involved in it's already a complex logistical problem. Then if you put on the politics on top of that, you suddenly find, I suspect if you're Canadian, you kind of know most of this. But as an outsider, as somebody from the UK coming into this, with our way that we did things over there and being very versed in that, I look at this and think, this is not going to go well. People are going to get in the way. They've got to get out of the way so that we can actually do what's required, which is to save people's life, get them jabbed up and have a success at this. And then on top of that, you've got the logistical problems of not having enough vaccines in the country. We had contracts for 500 million vaccines signed up in January. The population of Canada is 38 million. I've made a big pitch at the start of this conversation because there's a very political dimension to this whole distribution system. A normal retail supply chain would never encounter. So on top of the sheer scale of the operation, all the different players that have to work together on it, politics plays a big part in this because it is this drive to reopen the economy and get ahead of the other countries. But as I mentioned earlier on, that some of our pharmacy retailers are stepping up. I know that in the UK, lots of ex-medical people have stepped forward, maybe 500,000, 1 million people said, look, I'll help, just let me loose. I want to protect our citizens. I want to contribute. I've got the skill. And there's some challenges with signing those people into administration. And there's certain non-medical training they have to go through or have proof that they've done before they can actually do something which they're very capable of doing. And these are all like obstacles that prevent us from saving lives.
How wonderfully complex all this is. All right, let's maybe talk about the administrative challenges then. Right, let's assume there's enough production. Let's assume it's shown up okay on the flight in Toronto, managed to get okay in Vancouver. What are the administrative challenges specifically? What is going on? Big problems.
Firstly, you need to know what you've got. How many vaccines have you got? Because you may have to ration. So you have potentially have your list of, you have all your public health records or all your health records of all the different people, different age groups, different health conditions, etc. And you've been able to assess their vulnerability and maybe categorize that into different groups, like the over 80s, the over 70, over 60, essential workers like the police, healthcare workers, retail workers, teachers. That in itself is a kind of very value-laden kind of decision-making. In the calm of after this has all happened, somebody be putting a spotlight on that and starting to examine choices being made. So that's a pretty tough one in its own way. So you've got, say, 400,000 coming in, maybe 100,000 this week, 100,000 next week. So you've got your 100,000. You have to reach out. You can't really do very much until you've got it in your hand. As soon as you've got that in your hand, now you can actually plan out who you're going to bring to what place, and then you can work out, say, you're doing BC in maybe 4 or 5 major towns. So you divide 100,000 by 5 equals 20,000. Right, that's what we're going to do. Of course, there's a very much simplified problem because the demographics may be completely different to what I've indicated. Then you have to line them up one at a time to come in. It could be 20,000 people you're trying to line up, and of course there's always people who can't make the appointment, etc. But you must have, and particularly in Canada, you need to make sure you've got to have this medical staff and bookkeeping staff who are going to keep the records for you. And so you can line up these people one at a time to get inoculated, sit over there for 10 minutes in case there is a reaction, and then release, noting what vaccine they had on what date, what time, and to then chase that up to say that in 20 days' time, assuming you get either the same vaccine or the tests prove that you can actually mix up vaccines, to bring that person back in. So there's quite a complex logistical thing there because you don't know if you're going to get them. So our approach has tended to be is we'll have the vaccine and we'll split it in half and put the rest in the fridge or the freezer and just administer this. So we're in control of this. These 10,000 people are highly vulnerable. We're going to jab them up, and in 20 days' time, they can come back and we're going to take our reserve and do it again, which means that our ability to get to a high level of the population is like cut in half because we're not certain we're going to get our supply.
Wow.
We've got the complexity of the logistics of all this. Then we've got other constraints that we have to work around. There's a whole range of risks around the whole vaccine distribution thing. And one of those is theft, contamination, there's terrorist risks. There's obviously the delays I've talked about, which are often caused by rationing by the manufacturer or bottlenecks in the process. I think we're going to get it next week. So we better start doing some initial detailed planning. So now you could be selected to come forward on Tuesday to receive your vaccination at 9 o'clock, but we'll let you know again once we've got it in our hand. We often might think about it as just a transportation and the rest of it will take care of itself. And those people in that factory just didn't do a brilliant job. So, but as soon as they produce the vaccines, we can get it to places pretty quickly. But every element of this network has the potential to go belly up very quickly. there's lots of complexity in this. And I don't think that the early reports of how this might be managed and how it is actually being rolled out bear any resemblance to each other.
Yeah, wow. Just amazing. I'm curious, when it comes to people that do get vaccinated the first time, that have to be then informed to come back and get their second round, because without that, it's a little bit all for naught, right? How does that work? Is that done centrally by the government? Is that something that has some kind of central record keeping? And are there any kind of people don't show up, it like counts against them or something like that? Or what is, I don't know. I wonder if there are numbers of how many people actually come back.
So I'll answer the first one because it's relatively easy. We have public health devolved to provinces. So we have BC, British Columbia Public Health Authority, PHA, and they will be administering all the records, as we have in Ontario. The federal government, their job is to sign up the contracts, get the vaccine into the country, and then hand it into the public health authorities, of which in Ontario are being helped by the military to actually do, set up administration centres and do the vaccinations. In terms of the record keeping, that's part of what I call the admin of the administration. It's their responsibility to both call people in, make a note of what vaccine they had, what day, what time, any reaction, if there has been a reaction, and then to send out chases, whether that's a combination of letters, emails, and then to pull those back in. In terms of missing people, I think they would just keep, I don't know, but they could probably just keep issuing letters based on the fact that they were scheduled, but they didn't turn up. They still haven't turned up, and the PHA will probably reach out to them and say, hey, I've got your number, and why didn't you turn up? And they may then, we bump into a different aspect of, I would say, cultural, which is people who do not believe in vaccinations. And there's some people who are of a religious disposition who don't believe that, and some people of a cultural disposition don't believe that the vaccines are for them. This whole network is fraught, the supply chain is fraught with complexity.
Wow. Well, this is a little bit of a hypothetical question. If you were able to make decisions of what should change, of what kind of players should collaborate, of what kind of partnerships should be forged in order for this to be a successful drive, as successful as possible, what do you think needs to change? What are some amendments that you would make if you had the power to do so?
I might be just slightly out of date on this, because I knew there was discussion between a big North American pharma distribution organization called McKesson, and they were saying to the government, work with us, or we'll work with you, because guess what? We're doing the winter flu thing. We're in the pharma industry. We know what we're talking about. We know all the rules and regs, blah, blah, blah. Let us help you do this. I think there was some clashing somewhere along the way, because suddenly Sergeant Major, I've underscored him, fought in, jumped in under provincial instruction to make this happen. And as I say, he's done a brilliant job, given that he's had some major problems with the supply of vaccines to distribute and to administer. So I think it was sensible to put the military in charge of elements of the whole distribution network, and certainly around the PHAs and effectively the last mile. In terms of changing, I would have preferred to see pharma company involved much earlier on, because they can talk the same language with the pharma manufacturers, because they probably have relationships with these people already, and they know how to leverage those relationships much more efficiently than the government, who steps into this and says, here's a contract. I hope I've covered everything and covered every eventuality. Just give me my stuff. Maybe with some help from the military to expedite some of the areas where they just needed some extra resource to, whether that's administering the vaccinations or setting up the locations to administer vaccinations, or just expediting transportation. But somewhere in there, we should have had, in my mind, more involvement with the companies like McKesson, who are already in that space and they know how to do the majority of these things. There's an argument whether or not the vaccine should be compulsory, and we have a Charter of Rights, that's it, which specifies a number of things that you can and can't do to citizens. And I think forcing people to have a vaccination is outside the Charter of Rights. It would be a complete contravention of the right of the citizen to be self-determining.
Wow. As if the logistical challenges weren't enough. Like you said, you add on political and then human psychology, people believing one way or another, and which I guess to some extent is political too, right? Whether you can or can't force them, can and can't do, just adds an added level of complication to all of this. I've been reading some really interesting articles about different countries taking approaches that you would never think they would have to resort to, just to kind of get creative of how they move vaccines or what they do within the distribution. Is there anything interesting within Canada or outside of Canada that you've come across, which is like, oh, that's kind of a neat, quick and dirty solution that's really resulted from the desperation of having to get this done that otherwise just never have thought about?
The UK government, or Public Health England, has been responsible for doing the contracts, getting it into the country, whatever. But they actually chose to appoint somebody from industry to manage it. And if we look at the rate of progress, there's something like 16 million people already been vaccinated, or more than 25% of the population already been vaccinated. But they went one and in 12 weeks do the next one. So they've gone for a policy, instead of like we have here, is do the first one where you get potentially 50%. In 4 weeks' time, do the other one to get the 90%, where you get the 50%. And hopefully you may have already had it and therefore somewhat immune. So it kind of reinforces that immunity. And in 12 weeks' time, you get called back. There may be research that says we can use any of these vaccines, or we just have to keep with the one that we've administered the first time. But you've got 12 weeks to kind of get everything together. But I think using somebody from outside, I think the lady was from a PE firm or something like that, completely unrelated to pharmacy. So she's come in with a completely clear scope, get this done. And that's what she's executed on. And I think she's done a pretty brilliant job, given where we are and how lives are depending on the decision that she and all the team that's involved with this are executing against. When we think about Canada, I think we've had 900,000 vaccinations in the same period.
Right, that's wonderful. So I guess the last couple of questions would definitely be, now we're in the thick of vaccinations, inoculations, there's production happening, we're talking about all of this. I can imagine that in some months' time, maybe that's 12 months, maybe slightly longer, we're going to be in a position where we're maybe going to have a whole new set of challenges. Any predictions for what they might be? Any predictions for what is coming that may not necessarily be a challenge now? Because like you said, the bottlenecks or the issues keep changing. What do you think we're going to be up against in the near future?
We're just going to see bottlenecks moving all over the place. In true reactive style, we're going to jump on things, because some of this, the design of this network encourages a reactive approach, as I explained, that when it gets to the PHA, now we've got this in our hand. Now we can start working on how we're going to get these vaccinations administered to citizens. So that in itself is engendering, carry on being reactive. Because that's how generally supply chains tend to work, is wait until something happens, wait and see, and then react, rather than say strategically, what's the best route around this so we don't actually have to do too much firefighting. Beyond the vaccine, there's economic recovery, there's the processing of all the cases that haven't been screened, operations performed, procedures done, whatever it is, that is going to collide into the public health system. I can't emphasize how important it is to get the vaccines into the citizens to achieve herd immunity, to allow the economy to reopen, and to allow the public health system to switch from a complete and obsessive focus on COVID to other, I would argue, much more devastating diseases like heart conditions, obesity, diabetes, all these things that are just being pushed to one side while we focus on COVID. So the public health system will not, it's not like vaccines done, job done, back to normal. They will be under enormous pressure. I feel for all those medical people involved in the public health and the delivery of public health. If they thought that last year is tough, it's just going to be so much tougher for years to come.
Yeah.
They'll be dealing with those chronic diseases, they'll be dealing with mental health conditions, and many families will be suffering greatly, not from COVID, but COVID-related outcomes. While everybody's focused on COVID, they're not dealing with the other serious conditions people have had.
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to be a long recovery, all kinds of recovery, right? Not just physical.
And will we learn anything from this? And when we think about in industry, I've been dying to get hold of a warehouse and network to redesign it for social distancing from square one, not kind of, well, a number of my colleagues have said, oh yeah, we've done the social distancing. What did you do differently? Oh, we took out some canteen chairs so that we sit further away, and we give them some hand sanitizer, and jobs are good. And no, I'm talking about the fundamental design of a warehouse so that people don't get anywhere near each other as they go around doing this picking and packing, marshalling, loading. The whole thing, we must do this because we need to have businesses which are really resilient to future occurrences like a pandemic. I don't think people are even thinking that far ahead, but I'm already on that to think about what that might look like in terms of warehouse management system design, how we configure that in a different way, the architecture of warehouses, the processes, the way we bring about a certain amount of cultural change, how we measure success around here. And that goes into retail outlets, transportation systems, the whole lot. We need to have a real rethink because we're just being pretty lazy in our thinking what might happen ahead, and what are the implications, and what will we learn, and what will we be doing so much better to protect our citizens, our workers from these kind of events in the future. We need to find resilience. And if that means bringing pharmacy back into Canada in terms of manufacturing, expanding our hospital resources, yes, all these things must be done. We must learn from this. We must use that learning to actually make progress. Otherwise, it happened again. These epidemics or pandemics, we've had 5 of them in the last 20 years. It's not, we got lucky so far, but it's not like it was a black swan moment. It hasn't happened for 100 years. It's been happening all the time. It's just that it hasn't come to Canada, except that we had a bit of SARS, and that wasn't enough of a warning to say, you got lucky this time, you need to invest now, you need to do the right things so our businesses, our economy can be resilient. And I think that's a message not just for Canada, that's for all countries across the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think it's surprising that it happened. It's actually surprising that it did not happen for such a long time, right? So final thoughts then. I think we started this conversation out talking about how retail and other industries will change as a result of everything that we've learned from COVID, from the vaccine distributions, etc. Final thoughts on what you think is permanently going to be different in the world of supply chain as a result of this pandemic?
Well, in theory, given the outbreak, certainly in Canada, of e-commerce, in where I've come from, we've been a lot more mature about e-commerce, it's much higher saturation and volumes. But in Canada, it's really taken off. Lots of people who've never used e-commerce became experienced users fairly quickly. We will see, in theory, a reevaluation of the supply chain in terms of its importance to businesses to be, certainly in retail businesses, or the end-to-end retail supply chain. That will be repositioned in terms of the agenda for leadership team, the C-suite. The reality is quite different. I've heard so much almost Twitterati about we're resilient, we're agile, we're always kind of, we've skipped lean, we skipped over little, we're doing away with lean, we're going to agile and resilient, we're pivoting this way, pivoting that way, whatever. And I keep having to ask, well, what's different now than what we were doing a year ago? And The answer is a version of we're just working a bit harder, but it sounds good if we use these terms because they're very fashionable. We need to make sure that businesses value their supply chains in a much different way than they ever have done before. And the difficulty with the supply chain as it has existed is it's an invisible kind of hidden factory. It's doing its thing, it's getting stuff onto shelves, onto backs of vehicles to go to people's home addresses, wherever it might be. It's only when it goes wrong does it raise its attention. And that's not a good platform for us to say, we need a couple of million to do this, we need a few more million to do that, and we need to get into micro fulfillment centers, develop that, and dark warehousing, and all these other things, against the merchandise. Say, well, we're going to do our assortment, it's going to be really good from the store, saying we're going to create this great experience, store-based experience and marketing. This is the segments we're going after. This is how we're going to address them. So the supply chain has always been really down there in the gubbins. And on top of that, the supply chain has always been verticalized. It's been run in silos. So you have, often, depending on the scale of the operation, you might have a transport department, you might have your warehousing department, you might have your inventory control department. You always got their own separate budgets, their own set of priorities and scopes and stuff. And often inside the organization, they're constantly battling against each other. The supply chain is a horizontal process. It needs to be ripped out of all these other functions that want to get hold of bits of it, but not have any responsibility for the whole thing. We need to put it horizontally on the bottom of the organization and understand this is how we deliver value to the consumers. This is how we fulfill their requirements. It's the supply chain that does that.
Yeah.
And that person who looks after that sits with the other C-level executives and helps them make more informed choices about things like store location and the implications from a fulfillment point of view.
Wonderful. So a lot more strategic, a lot more preemptive than reactionary then.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wonderful. All right.
Big culture change.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's coming.
It is coming. It's coming. I mean, you and I have been saying this for a number of years now, but hopefully a pandemic is what it takes for that to happen. So just as closing, would you like to tell our listeners who it is that you can help, who should come to you, and how they can get in touch with you, Gary?
I've been an interim executive working in the retail supply chain for quite a few years, about 30 odd. And I've seen a whole range of different things. And my thing is bringing innovation in terms of network design and fulfillment approaches, particularly in last mile. I'm very well known in Canada for last mile. I've done digitization of parts of the supply chain. I'm really quite keen to help an organization digitize its overall supply chain. It's a big project, but I think that's very worthwhile. And also actually implementing agility. I've done that many times in the UK. And the other couple of areas, which you might say is a continuum, is business turnarounds. I'd like to say 1 trillion of them, but I've done many business turnarounds. And of course, many businesses are facing some really tough decisions. And I've led companies through turnaround and the strategic transformations, certainly around the supply chain, repositioning that within organizations. Those sort of 5 areas which I've been majoring through my career. In terms of contact to me, LinkedIn, highly visible there. Just reach out if you like what I say and you want to continue the conversation. Send me an invite, but tell me that you've listened to this conversation, or write to me at gary.newbury@supplychainspecialists with an S on the end.com.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for taking out the time to chat with me, Gary. I am very, very sure that this would be helpful, if not to people working in the vaccine distribution space in Canada, but even outside of Canada, because it's similar challenges, similar problems. And I look forward to keeping the conversation going.
Thank you for the opportunity to share some insights in the wider span of this vaccine distribution activity.
Thank you for listening today. I hope the information has been valuable for you and your team. You can connect with me via the website retail.ca and go to the contact page, or via LinkedIn by typing linkedin.com/in/last mile. Look forward to hearing from you and playing an active part with your supply chain and your business's transformation as you start to act boldly, think big, scale, adapt, and win.